My name is Helen Morrison, and I am 70 years old. And 5 years ago, I did something that I never imagined I would do. Something that started as a way to fill empty hours during the Christmas season, but ended up completely transforming how I understood my own life and what it meant to truly give. It began on a cold December morning when I woke up in my quiet house and realized that for the first time in 50 years, I had nowhere to be on Christmas Day because my children were spending the holiday with their in laws, and my husband had passed away 2 years earlier. And suddenly, the season that had always been filled with cooking and wrapping and hosting felt hollow and pointless. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee getting cold in front of me, looking at the Christmas cards on my refrigerator from people whose lives were moving forward, while mine seemed to have stopped, and I felt this crushing weight of loneliness mixed with something else, something like shame that I had built my entire identity around being needed by my family, and now that they didn't need me, in the same way I had no idea who I was supposed to be. The house was decorated the way it always had been, the same ornaments on the tree, the same wreath on the door, the same stockings hanging, even though there was nobody there to fill them, and the emptiness of those traditions, without the people who gave them meaning, made everything feel like a performance I was putting on for an audience that had left the theater. I had spent weeks baking cookies that nobody would eat, and wrapping presents for people who lived too far away to visit, and planning a Christmas dinner that I would eat alone from a TV tray. And the absurdity of it all hit me so hard that I actually laughed out loud, a bitter sound that echoed in the empty kitchen. I knew I needed to do something different, something that would make this holiday feel less like a reminder of everything I had lost, and more like an opportunity to discover something new, but I had no idea what that something might be until I saw a flyer at the grocery store asking for volunteers to deliver Christmas meals to homebound seniors. The flyer had a photo of an elderly woman smiling at a volunteer, bringing her a plate of food, and something about that image stopped me in my tracks because I realized that I had been so focused on my own loneliness that I hadn't considered that there might be other people, maybe hundreds of them, who were spending Christmas alone, not by choice, but because they had no other option. I stood there in the frozen food aisle holding a bag of peas and staring at that flyer, and I felt something shift inside me, a small crack in the wall of self pity I had built around myself, and before I could talk myself out of it, I pulled one of the tear off tabs with a phone number and shoved it in my pocket. That evening, I called the number, and a cheerful woman answered and explained that they were coordinating meal deliveries on Christmas Day to people who couldn't leave their homes, and she asked if I would be willing to take a route of 5 or 6 addresses. I said yes, even though my hands were shaking as I held the phone because I was terrified of going into strangers' homes and not knowing what to say or do, terrified that I wouldn't be good at it or that I would somehow make things worse for people who were already struggling. The woman on the phone seemed delighted by my willingness to help, and she told me that I would receive the meals already prepared and packaged, that my only job was to deliver them with a smile and maybe spend a few minutes visiting if the person wanted company. She said that some people would just take the food and close the door, and that was fine, but others might want to talk, and I should be prepared for that possibility. I agreed to everything she said, even though I felt completely unprepared for any of it. And after I hung up, I sat there wondering what I had just committed myself to and whether I was brave enough to actually go through with it. The days leading up to Christmas took on a different quality after that phone call, because instead of dreading the holiday, I found myself nervous about it in a way that felt almost like anticipation, like I was getting ready for something important, even if I didn't fully understand what it was. I kept imagining the people I would meet, trying to picture their faces and their homes and what they might say to me, and I found myself hoping that I would be able to bring them something more than just a meal, something like comfort or connection, or at least the knowledge that someone cared enough to show up. On Christmas morning, I woke up at 6 with my stomach in knots, that particular kind of anxiety that comes from stepping outside your comfort zone and doing something that feels both meaningful and terrifying. I got dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were nice, but not too fancy, because I didn't want to seem like I was showing off or treating this like some kind of charity performance, and I kept checking my reflection in the mirror, wondering if I looked like someone who could bring comfort to strangers or if I just looked like a nervous old woman who had no business doing this. The organization had told me to arrive at the community center at 9 to pick up the meal, and I left my house early because I was worried about getting lost, even though I had driven those streets 1,000 times. When I pulled into the parking lot, there were already a dozen other volunteers loading insulated bags into their cars, mostly younger people with their children helping, and I felt suddenly out of place and wondered if I was too old for this, if I would slow everyone down or mess something up. A woman with a clipboard spotted me standing by my car looking uncertain, and she came over with a warm smile and introduced herself as Denise, the coordinator I had spoken with on the phone. She thanked me for coming and handed me a list of 6 addresses along with detailed directions and a stack of meal containers that were still warm to the touch. She explained that each meal included turkey, stuffing, vegetables rolls, and a slice of pie, and that I should knock loudly because some of the recipients were hard of hearing. She also gave me a sheet with information about each person, their name and age, and a few notes about their situation. And I remember scanning the list and feeling the weight of what I was about to do because these weren't just addresses, they were real people with real lives and real pain. The first address was for a woman named Dorothy who was 89 and lived alone in a small apartment building that looked like it had been nice once, but had fallen into disrepair. I parked on the street and sat in my car for a moment, gathering my courage, holding the warm meal container in my lap and trying to figure out what I would say when she opened the door. Finally, I forced myself to get out and walk up the cracked sidewalk to her building, finding her apartment number on the second floor and climbing stairs that smelled like old carpet and something I couldn't identify. I knocked on her door louder than felt natural, remembering Denise's warning about hearing problems, and after what felt like an eternity, I heard shuffling footsteps and the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened just a crack, and I could see one eye peering out at me with suspicion, and I held up the meal and said in my brightest voice that I was bringing Christmas dinner from the community center. The door opened wider, and I saw Dorothy for the first time, a tiny woman with white hair and a face full of wrinkles that somehow made her look both ancient and childlike. She looked at the food and then at me, and her expression shifted from suspicion to something like wonder. And she said she had been worried that nobody would come because last year the volunteer never showed up, and she had spent Christmas eating crackers. My heart broke hearing that, and I told her that I was definitely here and that I hoped she would enjoy the meal, and she invited me in with a gesture that seemed both shy and eager. Her apartment was small and cluttered but clean, filled with photographs of people I assumed were family members and knickknacks that probably had stories attached to them. She asked me to put the food on her little kitchen table, and then she just stood there looking at it like it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and I felt tears starting to form in my eyes because I had never realized that something as simple as a hot meal could mean so much to someone. Dorothy asked if I could stay for just a minute, said she didn't get many visitors and it would be nice to have company even briefly, and I found myself sitting down at her table, even though I had 5 more deliveries to make. She told me about her husband who had died 15 years ago, and her daughter who lived far away and rarely called, and about how the holidays were the hardest time because she remembered when her apartment used to be filled with noise and laughter, and now it was just her and the television. I sat with Dorothy for 20 minutes. That felt like both an eternity and no time at all, listening to her stories about Christmases past and watching her face light up when she talked about her grandchildren who she hadn't seen in years. She showed me a photograph of them when they were small, 2 little boys with gap-toothed smiles, and she said they were grown now with children of their own, but they never visited, and she understood because people were busy and life moved on. The resignation in her voice when she said that crushed something inside me because I recognized it. That same acceptance of loneliness that I had been cultivating in my own life. That belief that being forgotten was just what happened when you got old. When I finally told her I needed to continue with my other deliveries, she walked me to the door and hugged me with surprising strength for such a small woman, and she thanked me. Not just for the food, but for listening, for treating her like a person who mattered rather than just a charity case. As I walked back to my car, I felt shaken by the encounter. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made me question things I had assumed about my own life and my own problems. Here I had been feeling sorry for myself because my children were busy with their own families. But at least I had children who loved me and called me regularly. At least I had a house and enough money to be comfortable and the ability to get in my car and go wherever I wanted. Dorothy had none of those things, and yet she had smiled at me and thanked me and seemed genuinely happy that I had shown up. And I realized that my loneliness was a different kind than hers. Mine was situational and temporary, while hers was structural and ongoing. The second address on my list was for a man named James who was 74 and had recently lost his wife. And when I knocked on his door, it took even longer for him to answer than it had with Dorothy. When he finally opened the door, I could see that he had been crying. His eyes were red and his face was blotchy, and he looked at me with such raw pain that I almost stepped backward. I introduced myself and explained about the meal, and he nodded but didn't say anything, just took the container from my hands with a mumbled thank you and started to close the door. Something made me speak up before he could shut me out completely. Maybe it was the look on his face, or maybe it was something Dorothy had awakened in me. But I asked if he was okay and if there was anything else he needed. He stopped with the door half closed, and for a moment I thought he was going to tell me to leave, but instead his face crumpled, and he said today would have been his wife's birthday and he didn't know how to get through it. I asked if I could come in for just a moment, and he hesitated, but then opened the door wider and led me into a living room that was dark, despite it being mid-morning, all the curtains drawn against the winter light. The house had that particular stillness of a place where someone is grieving, where every object seems heavy with memory, and the air itself feels thick with absence. James sat down on the couch and I sat in a chair across from him and he started talking, the words pouring out like he had been holding them back for months and finally found someone who would listen. He told me about his wife Margaret and how they had been married for 51 years, how she had died suddenly from a heart attack 6 months ago while he was at the grocery store, how he came home with bags of food to find her on the kitchen floor, and how that image haunted him every time he closed his eyes. He said that everyone had told him time would make it easier, but it hadn't. If anything, it had gotten harder because the shock had worn off, and now he was left with the reality that she was never coming back and he had to figure out how to live in a world without her. I listened without trying to fix anything or offer platitudes about how she was in a better place or how he would see her again someday. I just listened and let him pour out his grief into the space between us. He showed me photographs of Margaret, pictures from their wedding and from vacations and from ordinary moments that became precious only in retrospect. And he talked about how she used to make a special breakfast on Christmas morning and how the smell of it would wake him up better than any alarm clock. He said he had thought about not eating anything today, just going to bed and trying to sleep through what would have been Margaret's 73rd birthday, but now that I had brought him food, he felt obligated to at least try to eat it, even though he hadn't had much appetite since she died. I told him about my own husband passing away 2 years earlier, how I understood that particular kind of loneliness that comes from losing your partner, and something in his face softened when he realized I wasn't just some cheerful volunteer who couldn't possibly understand what he was going through. We talked about grief and how it changes shape but never really goes away, how you learn to carry it rather than overcome it, and how the holidays make everything harder because they're supposed to be about joy and togetherness, and all you feel is the absence of the person who made those things possible. James asked me how I had survived the first Christmas without my husband, and I told him honestly that I had barely survived it, that I had spent most of the day crying and eating ice cream and watching terrible television, but that this year I had decided to do something different, which was why I was here delivering meals. He looked at me with something like curiosity and asked if it was helping, if being here with strangers was easier than being alone with my own grief, and I realized I didn't know the answer yet, but that something about sitting with Dorothy and now with him was making me feel more alive than I had felt in months. I stayed with James for almost an hour, much longer than I should have given that I still had 4 more deliveries to make. But leaving felt wrong when he so clearly needed someone to witness his pain. When I finally did leave, he walked me to the door and shook my hand with both of his, holding on for just a moment longer than necessary, and he said that talking to me had helped more than he could express, and that maybe he would try to eat some of that Christmas dinner after all. Driving to the third address, I felt emotionally wrung out, like I had absorbed some of Dorothy's loneliness and James's grief and was carrying them with me in the car. I pulled over into a parking lot and sat there for a few minutes, trying to collect myself, wondering if I had the strength to do this 3 more times, to open myself up to 3 more stories of loss and isolation. Part of me wanted to just deliver the remaining meals quickly without going inside, without letting myself get drawn into their lives. But I knew I couldn't do that, because that would be treating them like a task to check off rather than people who deserve to be seen. The third address belonged to a woman named Rita, who was 68 and, according to my information sheet, was disabled and lived with her adult son. When I knocked, a young man in his 30s answered the door, and I could immediately tell something was off about him. His movements were jerky, and his eyes had trouble focusing. And his speech was slurred when he said his mom was in the back room. He let me in, and I followed him through a house that was cluttered and dirty, dishes piled in the sink and trash overflowing, and I felt my middle-class judgment rising up before guess. I pushed it back down and reminded myself that I had no idea what their circumstances were. Rita was in a bedroom, lying in a hospital bed that took up most of the space, and when she saw me, she smiled and tried to sit up, but winced with pain. Her son helped adjust her pillows and then disappeared back into the other room, and Rita apologized for the mess and for not being able to get up to greet me properly. She explained that she had multiple sclerosis and had been bedridden for the past year, and that her son Danny took care of her even though he had his own challenges, including AIs, traumatic brain injury from a car accident 5 years ago that had left him unable to work. She said they were getting by on her disability payments and his settlement money, but it was tight, and some months they had to choose between medication and food, and I felt ashamed of my own complaints about loneliness when these people were dealing with actual survival issues. I asked if I could sit with her for a few minutes, and she seemed delighted by the offer, patting the edge of her bed for me to perch on. Rita told me about her life before the MS, how she had been a nurse and had loved her work, how she had been active and independent and had never imagined she would end up like this, completely dependent on her son who himself was struggling. She talked about the guilt she felt for burdening Danny, for taking away his chance at a normal life, because he had to spend all his time caring for her, and I could hear in her voice that this guilt was eating her alive more than the disease itself. I told her that from what I could see, Danny was doing what he did out of love, not obligation, and that she shouldn't diminish his choice by calling it a burden. And she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said that nobody had ever put it that way before. Rita asked about my own life, and I found myself telling her things I hadn't planned to share. About my loneliness and my sense of purposelessness after my husband died, and she listened with the kind of attention that only people who have suffered can give, not trying to fix or compare, but just holding space for my experience. She said something that struck me deeply, that sometimes the people who seem to have the least are actually the richest in terms of what matters, that she and Danny might be poor and sick, but they had each other, and they had learned to find joy in small things, like a good meal or a kind word from a stranger. She pointed to a window where she could see a bird feeder that Danny had hung for her, and she said that watching the birds was one of her greatest pleasures now, that she had learned to slow down enough to notice things she had been too busy to see before. There was a wisdom in her words that came from having been stripped of everything she thought defined her and finding that there was still something essential left, something that couldn't be taken away by disease or poverty or circumstances. When I got up to leave, she reached for my hand and held it with surprising strength and told me that I had given her more than just a meal, that I had given her the gift of being seen and heard, and that she would remember this conversation long after the food was gone. Walking back through the cluttered house, I found Danny in the kitchen trying to wash dishes with water that wasn't quite hot enough, and I had this overwhelming urge to help him. But I knew that might seem condescending, so instead, I just thanked him for taking such good care of his mother and told him he was doing important work. He looked at me with those unfocused eyes and smiled and said she was worth it, that she had always taken care of him, and now it was his turn, and I felt humbled by the simple love between them that existed despite or maybe because of their difficult circumstances. The fourth address was for a man named Robert, who was 92 and a veteran. And when I arrived at his small house, I noticed the flag hanging by the door and the ramp that had been built for wheelchair access. Robert answered the door himself, moving slowly with a walker, and he was dressed in a button down shirt and slacks, like he had been expecting company, even though I was probably the only person who would visit him that day. He invited me in with old fashioned courtesy, thanking me for coming and asking if I would like some coffee. And when I said I didn't want to trouble him, he waved away my concern and said making coffee for a guest was no trouble at all, but a pleasure he rarely got to experience. His house was immaculate, everything in its place, and the walls were covered with military photographs and medals in frames, a whole lifetime of service displayed with obvious pride. Robert moved slowly to the kitchen, and I followed, watching him go through the careful process of making coffee with hands that shook slightly. And I realized that this ritual was important to him, that being able to serve a guest made him feel useful and capable despite his age and limitations. We sat at his kitchen table with our coffee and the Christmas meal between us, and Robert told me stories about his time in the service, about friends he had lost and places he had seen in a world that no longer existed. He had been married twice, widowed both times, and he had children who lived far away, and grandchildren he rarely saw. And there was a loneliness in his voice that was different from Dorothy's or James's, a loneliness that came from having outlived your entire generation and finding yourself stranded in a time that felt foreign. He said that when you get to be his age, you spend a lot of time with ghosts, that more of the people you love are dead than alive, and that sometimes he wasn't sure why he was still here when so many better people had gone. I told him that maybe he was still here to tell these stories, to be a witness to history, to remind younger people like me of what sacrifice and service looked like, and he seemed to consider this idea as if it hadn't occurred to him before. Robert talked about how the world had changed, how he remembered when neighbors knew each other and looked out for each other, when community meant something more than just living in the same area, and how now everyone seemed to be rushing past each other without really seeing or connecting. He said that delivering meals to strangers like I was doing today was the kind of thing people used to do naturally without needing an organization to coordinate it. And I realized he was right, that we had somehow created systems to manage kindness that used to flow organically between people. He asked me why I had volunteered to do this, and I told him the truth, that I had been feeling lost and useless, and had thought that helping others might give me some sense of purpose. And he nodded like he understood completely. He said that purpose was one of the hardest things to find in old age. That when you retire and your spouse dies and your body starts failing, you have to search for new reasons to get up in the morning, and some people never find those reasons and they just sort of fade away. Robert told me that he stayed alive by maintaining his routines and his standards, by getting dressed properly every day and keeping his house clean and trying to be ready in case someone needed him for something. And I found his determination to maintain dignity in the face of decline both inspiring and heartbreaking. When I finally stood to leave, he insisted on walking me to the door, despite how difficult it was for him to move with the walker, and he shook my hand with a firm grip that must have taken effort and thanked me for the meal and the company. He said that Christmas used to be his favorite holiday when his wives were alive and his house was full of family, but now it was just another day he had to get through. And that, having me visit had made it feel a little bit less empty. As I walked to my car, I turned back and saw him standing in the doorway watching me leave. This dignified old man in his pressed shirt holding onto his walker, and I waved, and he raised one hand in return before slowly making his way back inside. I sat in my car for a moment, feeling the weight of all these stories I was carrying, these lives that had been opened to me like books, and I realized that each person I had visited had given me something that had nothing to do with me helping them, and everything to do with them helping me see my own life differently. The fifth address belonged to a woman named Marie, who was 76 and lived in a senior apartment complex, and when I arrived, I could hear music playing from inside her unit. Before I even knocked, she opened the door wearing a bright red sweater with a Christmas tree on it, and she was smiling in a way that immediately felt different from everyone else I had visited that day. Marie was delighted to see me and the meal, inviting me in with enthusiasm and offering me cookies she had baked herself, and I was struck by the contrast between her energy and the exhaustion and sadness I had encountered at the other stops. Her apartment was small but cheerful, decorated with handmade crafts and photographs of what looked like dozens of children and grandchildren, and she explained that she had been a foster mother for 30 years and had raised over 50 children in her home. She said that most of them still kept in touch with her, sending cards and calling on holidays, and that several of them had invited her to spend Christmas with their families, but she had declined because she wanted to save a spot for someone who might need her more. Marie told me she had specifically requested to receive a meal delivery, not because she needed the food, but because she wanted to meet the volunteer and thank them for their service. And she wanted to make sure that whoever came to her door left feeling appreciated rather than depleted. She said she had been on both sides of charity work, had been the helper and the helped, and she knew that sometimes the people doing the helping needed support just as much as the people receiving it. I was stunned by her insight and her generosity, by the way she had turned what was supposed to be me serving her into her serving me. And I found myself tearing up as I told her about my day and the people I had met and how heavy it all felt. Marie listened with complete attention, and then she said something I will never forget. She said that bearing witness to other people's pain was holy work, that I shouldn't try to carry their burdens, but I should honor them by really seeing what they were going through, and that the heaviness I felt was the weight of connection, which was the opposite of the loneliness I had been trying to escape. She made us tea, and we sat together eating the cookies she had baked. And Marie told me about her philosophy of life, which she had developed through decades of loving children who weren't biologically hers, and teaching them that family was something you created through commitment rather than something you were born into. She said that every single child who had come through her home had taught her something, that the troubled ones especially had shown her depths of resilience and capacity for growth that she never would have believed possible if she hadn't witnessed it firsthand. Marie talked about how lonely she had been after her husband died 20 years ago, how she had almost let that loneliness consume her until she realized that she could either wait for people to fill the emptiness or she could go out and create connections herself. She said that's when she started fostering children, not because she thought she was some kind of savior, but because she needed them as much as they needed her, because having purpose and love in her life was what kept her going. I asked her how she maintained such a positive attitude when she had experienced loss and disappointment like everyone else, and she laughed and said she wasn't always positive, that she had plenty of days when she felt sad or angry or afraid, but that she had learned to let those feelings move through her rather than setting up permanent residence. She said the key was gratitude, not the fake kind where you pretend everything is fine, but the real kind where you acknowledge both the pain and the beauty of being alive, and you choose to focus on what you have rather than what you've lost. Marie told me that she was grateful for her body, even though it was old and creaky, grateful for her mind, even though it forgot things sometimes, grateful for every single day. She woke up because she knew too many people who hadn't gotten that chance. She asked me what I was grateful for, and I had to think about it because gratitude hadn't been part of my vocabulary lately. I had been so focused on what was missing from my life that I hadn't stopped to notice what was still there. I told her I was grateful for my health and my children, even though they were far away, grateful for the ability to drive and to help people like I was doing today. And as I said these things out loud, I felt something shift inside me, a small opening where light could get in. Marie smiled and said that was a good start, but that I should practice gratitude every single day, that I should wake up each morning and name 3 things I was thankful for before my feet even hit the floor, and that this simple practice would change my entire relationship with my life. She said that the people I had visited today, Dorothy and James, and Rita and Robert, they all had things to be grateful for, even in their difficult circumstances, and that maybe my job wasn't just to bring them food, but to remind them of their own strength and worth. We talked for over an hour, and when I finally left Marie's apartment, I felt lighter than I had all day, like she had somehow taken some of the heaviness I was carrying and transformed it into something manageable. She hugged me at the door and told me she was proud of me for doing this work, and that I should come back and visit her any time I needed to talk or just wanted some cookies and company. The sixth and final address was for a couple, Edward and Susan, who were both in their 80s, and according to my information sheet, were both dealing with health issues that made cooking difficult. When I arrived at their small house, I could see Christmas lights in the window and hear what sounded like laughter coming from inside. And I felt curious about what kind of situation I would find. Edward answered the door using a cane, and he greeted me warmly, calling back to Susan that the meal had arrived and inviting me in with genuine hospitality. Susan was sitting in a recliner with her legs elevated, and she apologized for not getting up, but explained that her circulation was poor and standing was difficult. They both seemed genuinely happy to see me and excited about the meal, and there was an easiness between them that spoke of decades of partnership and mutual care. Edward took the food to the kitchen and started plating it while Susan and I talked, and she told me that they had been married for 62 years and had raised 4 children, who were all coming to visit tomorrow for a second Christmas celebration. She said they had requested the meal delivery for today because they wanted to have a quiet Christmas day, just the two of them before the chaos of family descended, and I found this perspective fascinating because everyone else I had visited was desperately lonely while this couple was actively choosing solitude. Susan explained that they loved their children and grandchildren dearly, but that sometimes the visits were exhausting, all the noise and activity, and trying to keep track of everyone's dietary restrictions and schedule conflicts, and that having one day of peace together felt like a gift. She said that after 62 years of marriage, they had learned that they didn't need constant entertainment or conversation, that they could sit together in comfortable silence and feel completely content, and that this kind of companionship was something you earned through years of showing up for each other. Edward came back from the kitchen with 3 plates of food, having made one for me without asking if I wanted it. And he insisted that I sit and eat with them because Christmas dinner was meant to be shared. I protested that I had already taken up too much time at my other stops and should be getting home. But they wouldn't hear of it, and honestly, I was hungry and tired, and the idea of sitting with this comfortable couple and eating a warm meal felt like exactly what I needed. We sat together at their small dining table, and they held hands and said a simple grace that thanked the universe for food and friendship and another day together. And there was something so genuine in their gratitude that it made my eyes sting with tears. As we ate, they told me stories about their life together, about how they had met at a dance when they were both 19 and had known immediately that they were meant for each other, even though everyone said they were too young to know such things. They talked about the early years when money was tight and they were raising babies in a tiny apartment, how they would argue about stupid things and then make up and promise to do better. Susan said that marriage was work every single day, but that it was work worth doing, and that the key was remembering that you were on the same team even when you disagreed about strategy. Edward added that you had to keep choosing each other, keep deciding that this person and this relationship mattered more than being right or getting your way, and that there had been times when they had both been tempted to give up, but they had pushed through and come out stronger on the other side. They asked about my own marriage, and I found myself talking about my husband with more honesty than I had in years, telling them about the good parts and the hard parts and the ways we had failed each other and forgiven each other. I told them about the loneliness I had felt since he died, how I had been so focused on what I had lost that I hadn't been able to appreciate what we had shared. And Susan reached across the table and patted my hand and said that grief was just love with no place to go. She said I needed to find new places to put that love, whether it was into volunteer work like I was doing today, or into friendships, or into creative projects, or just into taking better care of myself, and that the love didn't disappear when the person died, it just needed to be redirected. Edward told me that after 62 years, he still didn't take Susan for granted, that he thanked her every day for choosing to stay with him, and that he tried to show her in small ways that she was valued and seen. He said that people thought romance died in long marriages, but it didn't. It just changed from passion to partnership, from excitement to comfort, and that both were valuable in their own ways. We finished eating, and I helped Edward clear the plates despite their protests. And as I stood at their sink washing dishes, I watched them through the kitchen doorway, sitting close together on the couch, and I felt this complex mixture of envy and happiness. Sad that I would never have that kind of long partnership again, but grateful that it existed in the world. When I finally prepared to leave, they both walked me to the door, moving slowly with their respective mobility aids, and Susan hugged me and said she hoped I would find peace and purpose in whatever came next, and that I shouldn't be afraid to keep opening myself up to new experiences even when it felt scary. Edward shook my hand and thanked me for spending Christmas with them, and I realized that I was the one who should be thanking them for showing me what enduring love looked like, and for feeding me both physically and emotionally when I needed it most. Driving home as the sun started to set, I felt completely exhausted and completely alive at the same time, like I had been on an emotional marathon that had pushed me to my limits, but had also shown me capabilities I didn't know I had. I thought about each person I had visited, how they had all been dealing with some form of struggle, whether it was loneliness or grief or illness or poverty, and how each of them had still found ways to maintain their humanity and dignity. Dorothy with her childlike wonder at receiving a meal, James with his raw, honest grief, Rita and Danny with their mutual care despite impossible circumstances, Robert with his determination to maintain standards, Marie with her infectious gratitude and wisdom, and Edward and Susan with their testament to enduring love. Each encounter had cracked something open inside me, had shown me that my own problems were both valid and small depending on how I chose to look at them, and that connection with other human beings was the antidote to the isolation I had been drowning in. When I got home, my house felt different somehow, less like a shrine to the past and more like a space full of possibility, and I realized that I had left that morning as one person and returned as someone slightly changed. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my living room, looking at my Christmas tree with its familiar ornaments. And instead of feeling sad about all the memories attached to each, when I felt grateful that I had those memories, that I had lived a life rich enough to accumulate so many moments worth remembering. I thought about Marie's advice to practice gratitude every morning, and I decided to start right then, naming out loud 3 things I was thankful for, even though it felt awkward, talking to an empty room. I was grateful for my health that allowed me to spend the day driving around and climbing stairs and sitting with people who needed presence. I was grateful for my car that was reliable and warm and gave me the freedom to go wherever I wanted. I was grateful for the 6 people who had let me into their homes and their lives and had given me the gift of their stories. The next morning, I woke up, and before getting out of bed, I named 3 more things I was grateful for. And I kept doing this every single morning until it became as automatic as breathing. But the bigger change came in the days and weeks after that Christmas, when I realized that the experience of delivering meals had fundamentally altered how I moved through the world and what I thought my life was supposed to be about. I called Denise at the community center and asked if I could sign up to deliver meals regularly, not just on holidays, but weekly or even more often if they needed volunteers. And she sounded delighted and said they absolutely needed reliable people who could commit to routes. I started delivering meals every Tuesday and Thursday, eventually taking on a regular route of 8 people who I got to know over time, learning their stories and preferences and routines. Some of them just wanted the food and a quick hello, and that was fine, but others craved conversation and company, and I found myself staying longer than necessary because I genuinely enjoyed talking with them. I met a woman who had been a jazz singer in her youth and would hum old standards while I helped her organize her medication. I met a man who had been a carpenter and who taught me about different types of wood and how to recognize quality craftsmanship. I met a former teacher who was losing her memory, but who could still recite poetry from her childhood with perfect clarity. Each person became a part of my life, someone I thought about when I wasn't with them, someone whose well-being mattered to me. I started bringing little extras on my deliveries, a magazine article I thought someone might enjoy, a small plant for someone who loved gardening but couldn't get outside, anymore, a photograph I had taken of something beautiful I had seen and wanted to share. These gestures cost me almost nothing, but they seemed to mean everything to the recipients, and I realized that what most of them craved wasn't charity but connection, wasn't pity but being seen as fully human with interests and opinions and value. I began to understand that I had started this volunteer work thinking I was the one with something to give, that I was the helper and they were the helped. But the reality was, much more complex and reciprocal than that simple formula suggested. My clients, as I came to think of them, were teaching me constantly about resilience and acceptance and finding joy in small things. And I was learning lessons about aging and loss and meaning that I couldn't have learned any other way. One of the most profound changes was how I started to see my own aging, which I had been fighting against with denial and fear, as something that could be navigated with dignity and even grace if I learned from the people I was serving. Robert taught me that maintaining standards and routines wasn't about being rigid, but about preserving a sense of self when so much was being taken away by time. Dorothy showed me that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but actually a form of courage, that being willing to need help and accept it when it came required more strength than pretending you could do everything yourself. Rita demonstrated that your worth wasn't determined by your productivity or independence, but by something more essential that couldn't be diminished by circumstances. Marie embodied the truth that you could choose your attitude even when you couldn't choose your situation. That gratitude and generosity of spirit were decisions you made every single day. Edward and Susan proved that love could deepen and mature and become something even more beautiful than the passionate intensity of youth. These lessons weren't abstract concepts I read in books. They were lived wisdom I witnessed firsthand in people who were doing the hard work of being human in difficult circumstances. My relationship with my own children improved during this time, though not because anything dramatic happened, but because I stopped needing them to fill all my emotional needs and started showing up as a more complete person who had her own life and interests. When they called, I had things to talk about beyond just asking about them. I could share stories about the people I was meeting and the experiences I was having, and they seemed relieved and interested in this version of their mother who was engaged with the world rather than waiting for them to provide meaning. My daughter told me that she had been worried about me after her father died, that she had felt guilty for not being able to fix my loneliness but hadn't known what to do, and that seeing me find purpose in volunteer work had lifted a burden she had been carrying. My son said that he was proud of me for doing something scary and difficult, and that it inspired him to think about what he might do to contribute to his own community. These conversations felt different than they had before, more equal and mutual rather than me being the mother waiting for attention from my busy children, and I realized that part of what had made me so lonely was that I had put all my eggs in one basket, expecting my family to be my entire world, and then feeling bereft when they naturally needed to live their own lives. The volunteer work gave me a separate identity and community, people who knew me as Helen, the meal delivery volunteer, rather than Helen the widow or Helen the mother, and this multiplicity of roles made me feel more solid and real. I started attending the monthly volunteer meetings at the community center, where I met other people doing similar work, and I formed friendships with several women my age who understood both the rewards and challenges of this kind of service. We would go out for coffee after the meetings and talk about our roots and the people we served and the ethical dilemmas we sometimes faced, like whether to report suspected abuse or neglect or how to handle it when someone asked us for help we weren't authorized to provide. These friendships became important to me in ways I hadn't anticipated, providing a social network that was based on shared values and purpose rather than just proximity or history. One woman named Patricia became particularly close, and we started doing things together beyond the volunteer work, going to movies and taking day trips, and having long conversations about life and aging and what we wanted our remaining years to look like. She had also lost her husband and understood the particular loneliness of widowhood, but she had a different approach to it than I had initially taken. She had embraced her independence and saw this phase of life as an adventure rather than a loss. Patricia traveled frequently, taking trips alone or with other women, and she encouraged me to come with her on a cruise she was planning. The idea terrified me because I had never traveled without my husband and didn't know if I could manage all the logistics and uncertainties alone. But she said that was exactly why I should do it, to prove to myself that I was capable and independent. I went on that cruise and it was transformative, not because anything dramatic happened, but because I discovered that I could navigate unfamiliar situations and make decisions and enjoy myself without anyone taking care of me. I met people from all over the world and had conversations that lasted for hours. And I realized that my life wasn't over just because my role as a wife had ended, that there were still experiences to be had and growth to achieve if I was willing to take risks. When I came back from that trip, I had a new appreciation for the life I had built through volunteering. Because while traveling was exciting, it was the regular rhythm of showing up for people who needed me that gave my days structure and meaning. I continued delivering meals twice a week, and I added another volunteer activity, reading to residents at a nursing home on Saturday mornings, because I had discovered that I liked being useful and that having commitments outside myself kept me from falling back into the isolation that had consumed me before. The people at the nursing home were different from my meal delivery clients because they were living in an institutional setting rather than maintaining their independence. And witnessing the range of aging experiences from people managing at home to people requiring full time care gave me a more complete picture of what lay ahead. Some of the nursing home residents were sharp and engaged, frustrated by their physical limitations, but mentally present and eager for stimulation and conversation. Others had dementia or Alzheimer's and existed in a different reality, sometimes thinking I was their daughter or their sister or someone from their distant past. I learned to meet people where they were, to not correct their confusion, but to enter into their experience and provide whatever comfort or connection they needed in that moment. One woman thought I was her childhood friend Mary and would tell me stories about adventures they had shared. And rather than explaining that I wasn't Mary, I would just listen and respond and let her have that joy of remembering. A man who had been a professor would sometimes give me lectures on subjects he had taught decades ago, his mind still full of knowledge, even if he couldn't remember what year it was or whether he had eaten lunch. These interactions taught me about the resilience of the human spirit, how identity and memory and connection could persist even when so much else had been stripped away. I started to think differently about my own future and what I wanted for myself if and when I reached that stage of life where I couldn't manage alone. I had difficult conversations with my children about my wishes, about the kind of care I wanted and didn't want, about how important it was to me to maintain dignity and agency for as long as possible. These weren't easy conversations because none of us wanted to confront my mortality, but having them felt important and responsible, and I felt relieved knowing that my children understood my values and would advocate for me if I couldn't advocate for myself. The fifth anniversary of starting meal delivery work arrived, and the community center threw a small celebration for volunteers who had been with the program for 5 years or more, and I was surprised by how emotional I felt receiving a certificate of appreciation and listening to testimonials from clients who talked about what the deliveries meant to them. One woman said that knowing someone would show up twice a week gave her a reason to keep going during a time when she had been contemplating giving up, and hearing that made me realize how much power there was in simply showing up consistently and reliably. Denise, the coordinator who had signed me up that first Christmas, gave a speech about how volunteers like us were the backbone of the organization and how the relationships we built with clients were just as important as the meals we delivered. She shared statistics about isolation and loneliness in elderly populations, about how lack of social connection was as dangerous to health as smoking or obesity, and about how our visits were literally keeping people alive. I had known intellectually that what I was doing mattered, but hearing it stated so plainly and backed up with data made it feel more real and more significant. After the ceremony, several of us went out to dinner and we talked about why we did this work and what it gave us, and I was struck by how similar our stories were. Almost everyone had started volunteering as a way to deal with their own loss or loneliness or sense that life had lost meaning, and almost everyone had discovered that serving others had healed something in themselves they didn't even know was broken. We talked about the paradox of helping, how it seemed like you were giving to others, but really you were receiving just as much or more, and how this mutuality was actually the point, that we were all interconnected and everyone had something to offer regardless of their circumstances. One man who had started delivering meals after retiring from a high-powered corporate job said that this work had taught him more about leadership and humanity than his entire career had, that sitting with someone who was lonely or scared and just being present required skills that business school had never taught him. A woman who had lost her child to cancer said that helping elderly people had given her a way to channel her grief into something constructive, that caring for other people's Parents and grandparents helped her honor the memory of her son by doing the kind of good work he would have done if he had lived. Each story reminded me that everyone carried pain, and that the question wasn't whether you would suffer, but what you would do with that suffering, whether you would let it isolate you, or whether you would use it as a bridge to connect with others who were hurting. As I sit here now at 70 years old, 5 years after that first Christmas delivery, I can honestly say that volunteering changed my life in ways I never anticipated and gave me gifts I didn't know I needed. I am no longer the woman who sat at her kitchen table feeling useless and invisible, no longer someone whose identity was entirely wrapped up in being a wife and mother, no longer afraid of my own aging and mortality. I have purpose and community, and a deep sense of being connected to something larger than myself, and these things have made the second half of my 70s infinitely richer than I expected them to be. I still deliver meals twice a week, and I still read at the nursing home on Saturdays, and I have added other small volunteer commitments, tutoring adults who are learning to read, and helping at the local food bank during busy seasons. My weeks are full. In a way, they haven't been since I retired, but it's a different kind of fullness than when I was working. It's fullness that comes from choice and meaning, rather than obligation. I still have hard days when I feel lonely or sad or worried about my health and my future. But those feelings don't consume me the way they used to because I have tools now for dealing with them. Practices like gratitude and service and connection that pull me out of my own head and remind me that I am part of a larger human family. The people I serve have become friends in many cases, and I attend funerals when they die and feel genuine grief at their passing. But I also feel privileged to have known them and to have been part of their lives, even briefly. Some of them have told me that I saved their lives by showing up, but the truth is they saved mine just as much. They showed me that it was possible to face loss and limitation with dignity and even joy. And they taught me that being needed and being useful were things I could create for myself rather than waiting for someone else to provide them. I think about that first Christmas often, about Dorothy and James and Rita and Robert and Marie and Edward and Susan, about how each of them opened a door for me that led to a completely different life than the one I'd been living. Dorothy is gone now. She died peacefully in her sleep 2 years ago. And I was one of only 3 people at her funeral, which broke my heart, but also made me grateful that I had been able to bring some light into her final years. James moved to a facility for people with dementia, and the last time I saw him, he didn't recognize me. But I held his hand for a while and told him about Margaret, and he smiled, like he understood something, even if he couldn't remember the specifics. Rita is still hanging on despite her MS progressing, and Danny is still taking care of her with the same patient love he showed 5 years ago. Robert made it to 95 before passing away quietly, and his children told me at the funeral that he had talked about me often, about the Christmas volunteer who had taken time to listen to his stories. Marie is still going strong at 81, still baking cookies and spreading wisdom and gratitude wherever she goes. And we have lunch together once a month where she continues to teach me about living fully regardless of circumstances. Edward died 3 years after I met him, but Susan is still alive, still in the same house surrounded by photographs and memories, and I visit her regularly because she has become like family to me. These people and dozens of others like them have woven themselves into the fabric of my life, and I am infinitely richer for having known them. If I could go back to that morning 5 years ago when I sat at my kitchen table feeling lost and purposeless, I would tell myself that the answer to loneliness isn't waiting for someone to rescue you, but stepping outside yourself and finding ways to be useful to others. That meaning comes from connection and service rather than from being served, and that it's never too late to discover a new way of being in the world. I would tell myself that delivering Christmas meals to strangers would be the beginning of a transformation, that those 6 people I met on that cold December day would crack open something in me that had been sealed shut by grief and fear, and that what would pour out would be a life more authentic and connected than anything I had experienced before. I am grateful beyond measure for that first volunteer coordinator who signed me up, for the organization that gave me the opportunity, for every single person who has let me into their home and their life, and for whatever impulse pushed me to pull that phone number off the flyer in the grocery store. That simple act of saying yes to something that scared me has made all the difference, and I hope that sharing my story might encourage someone else who is feeling lost or lonely or purposeless to take that same leap, to find their own version of delivering meals to strangers, because I promise that the transformation works both ways, and the person who receives the most is often the one who thinks they are given. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can find a little warmth and hope in these stories too.